All right, well, welcome back to a series that we've entitled Faithful, Growing a Life That is Full of Faith. And if for some reason you missed last week, we didn't meet in our normal setting here, but the message is up online. You can listen to it, you can watch it through that avenue. But as we dive back into this series that we've entitled Faithful, How We Grow a Life of Faith, we're looking at this question through the lens of a man named Abram. And as we kind of dive into our passage for today, I want to go ahead and start out just by offending everybody here. Because there's a lot of things that people do that simply don't make sense to me. In fact, there's probably a lot of things that people do that don't make sense to you. And some things for me include someone that spends tens of thousands of dollars on a nice car and then they go take it off-road and mudding, right? That doesn't make sense to me. Get yourself a four-wheeler or use a beat-up old truck. Or people that put ketchup on macaroni. No sense. Now here's one I know that will deeply offend a number of people here. And that is people who wait until they have a child to figure out gender. I mean, for real, the technology is there now. You can know the gender of your child before they are born. In fact, with all four of our boys, I was so excited to figure out what we were having that we did this every single time. I could not wait, and I don't think my wife could either. And so it's just like, for real, it doesn't make sense to me. It's exciting to have a child. Why do you need to add another layer of excitement of not knowing the gender? And again, this is just me. This is who I am as a person, so feel free to judge away. And in fact, we have four boys now, and the reality is if we found ourselves pregnant again in the next couple of months, probably wouldn't even bother because it's just going to be another boy. But anyway, I know some people, that's not how you're wired, but this is just kind of true, though, about all human beings. And that is, sometimes it's hard to wait for things. It really is hard to wait, especially when you don't have to. Now, not waiting to find out gender of a child, not a big deal. It's a matter of preference, though I might give you a hard time if you do that. But the reality is there's a lot of other things in our life that we simply have a hard time waiting on. Many of us, it's true for us that we have a hard time sometimes waiting on God. We have a hard time trusting Him in that in-between process. The reality is, as human beings, we don't like to wait. No one likes to wait, especially when you can have it right now. And our unwillingness to wait and to trust God will remove potential blessing from our life. In fact, we see this arise numerous times throughout the narrative we're looking at of Abram. For many of us, it's a lot of work. It takes patience. It takes discipline to go through some intentional schooling and training for whatever occupation you want to go in. And if you choose to cut that process short, you can miss out on some neat blessings on the back end of that. Or maybe right now it's taking a lot of patience and trusting God as your marriage is going through this rocky season. And man, it would be easy just to hit eject and to get out of there, but the reality is if you walk through those hard situations together with your spouse, you're going to experience some significant blessings on the back end. The same is true for many of our relationships, maybe with our kids or a coworker, a neighbor, a parent. It's tiring. It's exhausting. It's slow. But the reality is, if we shortchange processes like that, we can miss out on some pretty neat blessings on the backside. And every single one of us probably have a story like that where we waded through a process and, man, we experienced great blessing on the backside. And I'm sure there's many of us as well that can tell a story of the exact opposite in our life where we just simply couldn't wait and we rushed a process and, man, we really missed out. So maybe you're here today and you've messed up. You were impatient. You needed God to move in your life, and you were just having a hard time trusting Him. And now you're here today just feeling that shame and that guilt. You're upset. Man, you can't believe that, man, you didn't trust God through this process. And so what I want us to wrestle with today, because that is true realistically for every single one of us is this question: how can we recover from failing to wait for God? How do we recover after failing to wait for God? Because in every single one of our lives, there are places of our lives where we were not able to wait on him. We could not extend that trust. We wanted to seize it and seize it now. Now we're picking back up in our narrative of Abram, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 13 through 14 today. We're not going to have time to look through the entire text just because it's a huge passage of Scripture, but keep your Bibles handy because I'm going to be referencing a number of scriptures within that text as we kind of tell the story of what's going on. But as we pick back up in Abram's life, the author tells Abram's story in such a way to draw an example for his readers. In fact, what we see emerge, and this is kind of the path we're going to take today, is that there's two types of people in our text today. Those who cannot trust God and simply can't wait on him, the cannots, and then those who can trust God and those who are willing to wait on him, the cans. Right? That's super creative, right? The cannots and the cans, but that's how the author depicts the individuals in our text. And so as we begin to dive into chapter 13, I want to kind of recall back a little bit of last week when we were first introduced to this man named Abram. Now, we see his story begin to emerge in chapter 11, but it really kind of becomes more clear in chapter 12. Because in chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, we see this conditional promise that God gave this man, Abram. And he told him to leave his homeland, to journey to a land that God will make his, and he will ultimately make this man a blessing to all of humanity. And as we followed his story last week, Abram begins this journey of faith. And we talked about the fact that even though he took one or two steps forward in his faith journey, along the way he began to lose his footing and lose trust in God, and he took a few steps back. And when he encountered problems, rather than trusting on God, he relied on natural solutions to those problems. One of the biggest ones that we said kind of drives the overall narrative of Abram's life is the fact that his wife, Sarai, is barren. They have no kids, no descendants. How in the world can this man father a nation if he can't even have one child? And so that's a tension point in the narrative, and to solve this problem, Abram brings Lot along with him on this journey just in case, kind of just we don't know what God's going to do, so maybe I got to rely on this. So he brings Lot along, displaying a lack of trust that God is going to provide him this descendant. But then while they're in the land, a famine emerges, right? Not uncommon for this day and age, but rather than trust God to provide for him and his family, he journeys down to Egypt to seek food, to seek security. And while there, he encounters an additional problem. You see, his wife, we are told in the text, is pretty attractive. She's gaining the eye of the royal family in Egypt, and in order to save himself, he deceives the royal family by saying, "This is my sister, not my wife." And he does this because he's fearful for his own life, and he's afraid that they'll kill him because of his wife. And so this is what he does. He deceives. He tricks people. He's coming up with his own solutions to problems. And as we read last week, soon Pharaoh gets wind of this after his household receives plagues. And rather than being a blessing to nations, here we have Abram journeying to Egypt and causing really curses upon a nation. But that is Abram's story, right? He's taking steps of faith. He's learning along the way what it means to have faith, what it means to trust God, what it means to wait for him. And finally, we end chapter 12 with him leaving Egypt and starting in chapter 13, verse 1, with him finally returning to the land. Look at verse 1 with me. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. The author starts chapter 13 allowing the audience to breathe a sigh of relief. Glad that's over. Abraham's back in the land. Or I should say, Abram at this point. This is good. This is a good reset. But you need to remember, as I already spoken about, There are two types of characters in our text for today: those who can trust and wait on God, and those who cannot. Abram, at this point, is setting himself up as one of those characters who can trust in God, but there's another individual. Once Abram makes his way back into the land of Canaan, he's there with his wife, and he's also there with Lot. And they're beginning to accumulate some possessions. They're beginning to accumulate large herds of animals. And the text tells us the following. Look at verse 5 through 7 of chapter 13. The text reads, "And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land." Just an additional note to let us know, hey, it's getting a little crowded. You got Lot's herd, you got Abram's herd, and then there's additional people dwelling in the land. And so Abram comes up with a solution for Lot. He doesn't want to fight. Instead, what he tells Lot is, why don't you take your pick of the land? You decide what direction you want to go, and I'll go the opposite direction. You go east, I'll go west. We'll split. You go west, I'll go east. Whatever you want to do, Lot. Let's not have this conflict. This is silly. And so Lot takes his pick of the land. I want you to read how the author describes Lot's thought process toward the land that he goes toward. Look at chapter 13 and verse 10. "And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered." Pause there for one moment. This is beginning to give us insight into Lot's thought process. He is looking at going east simply because it's well watered. And for an agricultural community like ours, that makes good sense. We like water. We need water to survive. Our crops need them to grow, and Lot needed it for his herd, but there is another motivation behind going east. You see, if he went west, he was going to have to rely on God to bring the rains. But if he goes east, he can rely on the Jordan River Valley to provide all of the moisture that he can foreseeably need. But it goes on. He notices that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord. And then it brings up this comparison, like the land of Egypt. Again, the author is foreshadowing something here. It's like the land of Egypt. Hey, Egypt, it wasn't a bad place from an agricultural perspective, but didn't they just leave Egypt? Didn't Lot and Abram just find themselves in trouble down there and have to flee? But he wants to go back to a place that's like Egypt. And then finally, it says they went in the direction of Zoar. And then the author makes this little editorial note. Again, some foreshadowing not only of Lot's judgment, but foreshadowing of what's to come. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chooses to go east. Not just because it's well watered, but because he doesn't have to rely and trust on God to bring the rain. He's not a great judge here of character, not a great judge in how to live a life of faith, because he's dwelling outside the promised land. East was not part of the promised land. Look at chapter 13, verse 12 through 13. The author tells us, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. And again, the author gives us some foreshadowing of what's to come. He says, now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So what was Lot's thought process in going east, right? We kind of talked about that. But he had a little bit of a response I kind of like to call, looks good. He was making a decision simply upon the path of least resistance, which is not always the best. See, when it comes to following Jesus, the path of following Jesus is incredibly hard. Jesus calls us to do some hard things, and so if we're making our life choices based upon what is the most easiest, what brings us the most immediate satisfaction, we're going to find ourselves in some serious trouble. if you live your life with a philosophy of, looks good, then you're going to spend money that you don't have for things that you don't need and find yourself in some trouble down the road. If you live with a philosophy of, looks good, you're going to find yourself in this habit of looking at images online that you have no business looking at. You're going to make decisions based upon your comfort, not your calling. And all along the way, you're shortchanging yourself of the blessings and the benefits of faithfully following God. Following Jesus is hard. And so living a life that operates off the philosophy of, looks good, is going to be problematic. Now, we finished chapter 13, and as you get into chapter 14, the narrative shifts. You open that up and you begin to read it, and you begin to hear about these military strategies, these military movements of different kings, and you read about battles that take place, and eventually you read about a campaign where you have 4 kings against 5 kings. And again, you might start reading through chapter 14 and wonder, why do I care about these battles? Well, we're meant to care about them as an audience because the kingdom of Sodom, right? The king of Sodom is involved in this conflict. And if you remember, Lot is now associated with Sodom, Abram's nephew. And so as you read through about these campaigns, the king of Sodom loses his military campaign, and he's forced to flee. And as a result, the conquering armies do what armies do during that time. They plunder and they take what they can. And it turns out that Lot is part of this plunder, right? They take not only material possessions, but they take people. Look at chapter 14, verse 11 through 12. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and they went their way. So Lot is captured. He's hauled up out of the land of Sodom, and Abram gets wind of this. And so Abram is able to raise up really what is equivalent to a small army. And he goes and he chases down these kings. He beats them in warfare, and then he takes all of these things back. The material possessions and the people. This is great. This is huge, and we're going to expand upon that in a moment. But in though steps the next character. As the king of Sodom kind of comes out of hiding because Abram has now defeated his enemies, he begins to make some demands upon Abram. But before we do that, I want to give you guys the blanks as you fill those in. First blank, the can't trust category. We have Lot, who departs. And then we have Bera, king of Sodom, who is destroyed, right? Remember, he was his city was ransacked. He was defeated in a military campaign. Can't trust, right? Lot is in that category, and so is Bera, king of Sodom. So back up. After Abram has now defeated these kings in a military campaign, he journeys back into the land of Canaan, and the king of Sodom comes out of hiding. And after being bailed out by Abram, he has the audacity to tell Abram, right, to make demands of Abram. And he tells him this. Look at verse 21 of chapter 14. He says, the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me, right? Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. Hey, I know you just bailed me out. I know you as the victor have the right to all of this, but you give me back the people and you could just take everything else, right? He's thinking, hey, I'm going to kind of restart. He's making a demand out of Abram that he has no business making. He's the loser. He doesn't get to decide. But why does this matter? Why does this matter in our narrative? I first want you to kind of evaluate the theology here of Bera, king of Bera, king of Sodom. He kind of makes the underlying theological statement of might makes right. Abram, you defeated all the kings. You get what you want. You can have land, you can have people, you can have things because you're the strongest. Another underlying theological statement within those demands is you make your own blessing. Abram, you were able to raise up people and you were able to go defeat these kings. Therefore, you have the right to experience the blessings of that warfare, the blessings of that one battle. And the reality is Bera, king of Sodom, is painted in a negative light in this narrative because of this mindset, especially compared to Abram's response, which we'll get to in a moment. But again, the embrace of such theology is what puts us at odds with God as well, as we're trying to grow in our faith. Right? We say to God, right, why should I wait? Why should I trust you if I can just seize what I want right now for myself? Why do I need to trust you in this difficult marriage relationship? To exercise patience and grace and mercy when I can just get even? I can prove them wrong. I can get the justice I deserve because they hurt me. See, the embrace of such theology, like Bera, king of Sodom's, brings pain. We say, God, why do I need to wait for you? Why do I need to trust on you if I can just chart my own course? God, you're not moving fast enough. I'm tired of waiting. I'm just going to go ahead and do it on my own. And what I want you to see, what the author wants to see, and this is going to come up more in the chapters to come, when you depart from God's will, when you trust yourself over God, when you are unwilling to wait and be patient upon him, you are going to bring destruction upon yourself and those around you. You're going to experience pain and failure, and maybe you're here today living on the back end of that. So what do we do? Well, those are the negative examples in our passage for today. Let's look at the good examples. Again, remember the emerging patterns, the cannots, those who can't wait for God and those who cannot trust him. But now we're going to move toward those who can trust God, those who are willing to wait on him, the cans. And even though Abram last week was a negative example of what it looks like to have faith, right, as he looked for natural solutions to his problems rather than trusting the God who made certain promises to him, Abram is a great example of someone who is willing to wait and to trust God. In fact, the author does something really neat in chapter 13 as he kind of reintroduces Abram's character to the narrative. Remember, Abram made his way back to the land of Canaan. This is good. As an audience, we breathe a sigh of relief. He's back where he needs to be. But then he kind of bookends chapter 13. He starts it and ends it with Abram building an altar. Right? He's going back to an altar he had built previously, and he's building a new one. In fact, look at chapter 13, verse 3 through 4. And he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. Abram's getting a reset, a restart. He's getting a fresh start. Right? He has now stopped making steps away from God, and he's now beginning to make steps back. He's building his faith muscle. So he's back where he started. And says, where Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who went with him, also had flocks and herds and tents. All right, we kind of covered that. But he's back where he started. Chapter 13 starts with Abram and this altar, and then it bookends with him building an altar as well. Look at the very last verse of chapter 13. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Abram is getting a fresh start. He is building his faith muscle. And this is important because the events that will unfold in chapter 14 as we discuss this military campaign. And as you read through, again, chapter 14, there's a lot of language that comes up and that reoccurs over and over and over again. And one of those words is this word melech, king. Comes up 28 times in chapter 14, and obviously it's necessary as we're describing some of the military events and campaigns of these kings. But the author is using this word over and over again for another purpose. Because when Abraham goes and defeats these kings, it paints a picture of his strength. Hey, he's the real strong one here. But even deeper, there's a deeper theological purpose. Because as we'll see, it's not Abram's strength that allowed him to defeat those kings. It was God who enabled him to beat those kings. And so when he does that and he has this interaction with Sodom, the king of Sodom, right, Bera, even though the king of Sodom tells him, hey, take what you want. It's yours. You won. This was Abram's response to him. Look at chapter 14, verse 22 to 23. He says this, but Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. So in the face of being told to take what he wanted, Abram refuses. You see, that the land that he could have seized at that time, it could have rightfully been his. He won those campaigns, but it was outside the promised land. He could have established himself with these possessions and these people, but he is instead willing to wait on God to provide what God promised him. He could seize it right now, but he chooses not to. He chooses instead to wait on God, to trust him to come through with the promise that he made. Abram got a fresh start. And this is neat, seeing him make these steps of faith. He's trusting God actively, and we'll see, even though Abram, even at this point in his life, takes 2 steps forwards, he's still going to take some steps back. This is what the Christian life looks like. But maybe today you need a fresh start. Maybe you have ventured far away. You've messed up. You failed. You were unwilling to be patient and trust God. Maybe your relationship with God needs a fresh start. It's never too late to come back and start afresh. This is the beauty of the gospel. But we have Abram here who gets that fresh start. He's in that can wait category. And then the next character we're going to kind of briefly touch on, even though there's a lot of theological discussion about this individual. But as I kind of give you these blanks to fill in, the can wait category, we have Abram, he restarts, and Melchizedek recalls. And so after Abram's victory over those coalition of kings, he interacts obviously with Bera, king of Sodom, but a different character emerges as well, a man named Melech. He's the king of Salem, and he recognizes that Abram's victory wasn't because of Abram's strength, but rather it came from God. In fact, look with me at verse 18 through 20 of chapter 14. The text introduces us to Melchizedek, king of Salem. Right? It says he brought out bread and wine, and it tells us that he was the priest of God Most High. It says, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Right? Melchizedek recognizes that Abram's victory came from God. He kind of stands in contrast to the other king that's introduced in this section, Bera, king of Sodom. Something kind of interesting happens after this exchange. Look at the end of verse 20. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. That's kind of interesting. Why would Abram give Melchizedek a tenth of all that he has? I believe this is intentional. It's a tangible reminder for Abram that all he has, God has given him. Not only the military victory he just accomplished and achieved, but even all the possessions he has is all from God, and this is an opportunity to give back a little. And here he's giving it back to a king, right? A priest of God. And again, this is a whole other theological discussion of why he's here, what he's doing, but we see this modeled, and this model continues throughout the Old Testament for the concept of the tithe, and we even apply it in many of our Christian contexts today. But maybe as you look back as Melchizedek recalls God's grace, maybe you need to recall what God has done for you in the past as you wait and trust on him. How has God blessed you in the past? What were the circumstances around it? What habits are you able to foster today that will help you to recall that all you have is from God? Maybe this very tangible application point there in verse 20. Maybe you need to begin to faithfully give to God as well, off the top, as a reminder that all you have is from him. Maybe it's giving up your time. Figure out a way to intentionally recall God's trustworthiness, his faithfulness, as you wait and trust on him. So maybe you have failed in the past. How can you recover after failing to wait for God? Well, as we kind of finish up, I want to show you 2 images here. A number of years ago, I found this old Honda Accord online. Found it for $500. I figured, you know what, I could probably get this thing going pretty well. The thing gets great gas mileage. These things run forever. And so I drove a few hours away to pick this thing up, and there were some obvious problems with it. The front brakes weren't working. It was pretty dirty and filthy, had some rust on it. There was kind of a pop on the front end that I had assumed were some joints or suspension issues. And so I get it home, kind of get it running all right, and begin to drive it around, and I keep hearing this popping. And I'm like, what in the world is this? And so I stick my head down under the car, and I notice that part of the subframe has literally rusted away. So much so that if I were driving down the road at, say, 60, 70 miles an hour and hit a good bump, the whole thing could possibly literally disintegrate and destroy the car or myself, right? And so I had a problem, right? I had messed up. I had sunk some time and money into this project, and now I have a car that really is, at best, going to be used for parts. Like, I could have fixed it, but I would begin to dump more money in it than it was worth. And so I left this thing in my driveway for a season, and every time I went out there, I was reminded that I had failed. I had messed up. I had made investments in the wrong place. And again, I kept weighing, do I continue to dump time and money into this thing, or do I just admit I messed up and sell it for a loss? And it sat in my driveway for a season. And it reminded me of my failure. And maybe for you in your life, you are regularly reminded of your failures. You see them regularly, right? The scars that you bear are emotionally, maybe even physically on your body. You're reminded of your failures and your mistakes, but here's the thing. When it came to this car, I got to the point where I realized I just need to get rid of this thing. I don't want this reminder of how I wasted my time and money. And so I was able to find someone who would buy it and essentially part it out. And I was able to recoup a little bit of that money. And even though I still have the regret, I no longer have the reminder in my driveway reminding me of my failure. Some of you have regrets in your life. You have reminders of your failure. What does this text encourage us to do in light of that? How do we recover after failing to wait for God? I believe the encouragement for us is to return to God and wait on him, as is modeled through Abram's life. He returned to where he needed to be, and he was willing to trust God and wait on him to provide. Is that something you are willing to do today? Are you willing to return to him and wait on him? Are you willing to correct your faithless behavior, right? Just cut your losses and go back to where you need to be. Are you willing to move toward faithful obedience that waits on God, or are you going to continue to sit there and spin your wheels and wonder, what's going on? Return to God and wait on him. You see, not waiting to discover gender is one thing, but not waiting on God is a completely different issue. So I want to encourage you today, right? If you've experienced pain in your life, how can you recover from failing to wait on God? You need a fresh start. You need to restart, reestablish, go back to where you once were. Return to God and wait on him. I have two questions for us, and we're going to finish up our time together. How have you failed to trust God in the past as you waited on him to move? And finally, what item in your life are you struggling to wait on God for? Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer.